Hey everyone, so welcome back to our YouTube channel. My name is Ashley and this is Heebie-Jeebies TV. And on this channel, we like to talk about a wide array of stuff. So we like to talk about the paranormal, true crime, unsolved mysteries, anything that would technically give you the heebie-jeebies. So on today's video, we are going to talk about a topic that is super interesting to me. I've actually been very fascinated with this topic, and that is reincarnation. And this has fascinated me ever since I was like 10, 12 years old, something like that. I always thought that it was so cool that there was definitely something more to life than us just being born here, living, working, and then just dying, and then that would be it. I was convinced that there was definitely something more to life. Reincarnation seems to explain quite a bit of it. So I definitely believe in it. I think it's something that is 100% possible in the realm of the universe. There's way more to life than what we see and what we even know. So, that being said, today's topic about reincarnation is actually going to be quite a famous story. It's actually going to be about the reincarnation of Anne Frank through a woman named Barbro Karlen. So, for those of you who don't know who Anne Frank is, she was actually a victim of the Nazis and the concentration camps during World War II. The reason she's so famous is because during World War II, her and her family, another family, and an individual man were able to stay in hiding in an attic in the Netherlands. And they were able to hide out there for most of the war up until the last few months, where unfortunately they were found, and then they were taken off to the concentration camps. Now, the reason Anne Frank is so famous is because she actually loved to write. She was a writer, and during her time in captivity in Amsterdam, she had written journals and journals of diary entries. And after the war was over, her dad was the only survivor, and he was able to go back to the house, retrieve her journal, and then eventually turn her entries into a very famous published book. So a lot of you are wondering how Anne was able to stay hidden for so long. And this was because, like I mentioned earlier, they were hidden in an attic in Amsterdam, but they were hiding in the workplace where Anne's father used to be. There was an empty attic upstairs, and the employees of the shop were actually non-Jews. So they agreed to help hide Anne and her family and a few other people up there. And they were the ones responsible for bringing them food and water. And so whenever the Nazis would do these random house searches, Anne's family was actually able to stay hidden because there was a certain bookshelf in an area that would lead to the attic. There was a bookshelf against the wall that actually concealed the door, so you would have never been able to tell that there was an actual doorway and then an alleyway and stairway upstairs if you didn't already know that was there. So like I said, unfortunately, Anne's family was discovered towards the end of the war during a house search, and they were all taken to concentration camps. They were all split up. Anne and her sister were taken to Auschwitz and then transported to Bergen-Belsen, where Anne actually died when she was only 15 years old. So fast forward 10 years to 1954, Barbro Karlen was born, and she was born in Europe. She was actually born in Sweden to a lovely, lovely family. And at this point, because it was only 10 years after the war, Anne Frank's story wasn't actually well known to the world. It wasn't the international story that it is today. Her book had been published by her father, but it still wasn't translated into all the languages that it's translated into today. And it definitely wasn't translated into Swedish at that point. So there's no way Barbro's family would have known about Anne Frank or her story at that point, or even Barbro being as young as she was, there's no way she would have known anything about Anne Frank. Signs of reincarnation with Barbro started very, very early as 3 years old, where Barbara was actually telling her parents that her name was not Barbro, and she was confused as to why they would call her something that wasn't her name. She kept insisting that her name was Anne Frank. And this behavior continued throughout her early childhood into her adolescence. By the time she was 10 years old, she was telling her parents that they were not her real parents and that she doesn't know why she was born into this family. And she was convinced that her real mother and father were going to come pick her up anytime. She was so convinced that this was the case that she basically, for a point in time, refused to call her parents mom and dad. So if you don't know much about reincarnation, there's quite a lot of signs that point to you being reincarnated, and they're not 100% confirmed that these are signs that you are reincarnated, but they are, I guess, signs that people have been able to put together and put the clues together and confidently say that these are some of the more popular signs that you were someone else in a past life. So these are usually stuff like phobias. Phobias that you have in your present life usually have something to do with something traumatic that happened to you in a past life, usually revolving around death. Strange birthmarks on your body are usually a sign of scars from a past life. Aversions or just distastes for certain things usually have something to do with your past life that you didn't like then and then have somehow crossed over into this life. And then just strenuous, tense-filled type of relationships, problematic ones in your current life usually are a sign of some sort of karmic relationship or unfinished business that you had with the previous person. But these types of signs actually did manifest themselves in Barbro's current life. She actually absolutely refused to eat beans. She hated them. She would only eat them if she absolutely had to. And coincidentally, beans were one of the primary sources of food that Anne Frank actually used to live off of while they were in hiding. She also had a really big fear, like an unreasonable fear of taking showers as a child. She would only take baths. And while there's not any way to confirm why this might be a cause for her fear, she thinks, and a lot of theorists might also agree actually, that her fear of showers comes from the concentration camps where they used to lie to the prisoners and tell them they were all going for showers, but in reality they were actually misleading them. So they would go into the gas chambers where they would be locked in, the lights would be turned off, and then they would be gassed to death. So as her teen years continued, she started developing or showing signs of other phobias. She also had a really big fear of people in uniform, and a lot of people think this has to do with her fear of the Nazi soldiers that had a very distinct, very obvious uniform that we all know of today. And throughout the years, she also had lots of nightmares of her being in the concentration camps. She would also tell her parents small details about Anne's life. There's obviously no way to confirm all of these details, but the details were so specific and just so unbelievable to her parents that most people tend to think that there must be some truth to them. As she got a little bit older, Barbro actually developed a passion for writing. She became such a good writer. She was so talented that she actually ended up writing a book that actually got published when she was only 12 years old, and this was called A Man on Fire. And as we all know, Anne Frank was also a writer who eventually would become published. With all these different signs pointing to some sort of reincarnation or at least some sort of interesting story, Barbro's parents decided to take her to a doctor, a therapist, psychiatrist, someone she could talk to be evaluated, because they weren't certain if she was actually experiencing something genuine or whether she was kind of just going a little bit crazy. Being concerned for their daughter, they take her to the doctor, and that's where Barbro kind of realizes that, this is probably not a good idea to talk about these experiences out loud. It seems to make people uncomfortable, so she kind of just decided to stop talking about it for a while. And whenever she would go to the doctor for these visits, she would never bring up Anne or her past life. And this kind of ended up leading the doctor to determine that there was absolutely nothing wrong with Barbro. Let's take it back a little bit to when Barbro was 8 years old and she was in elementary school. Now, by this time, Anne Anne Frank's story had started to gain popularity and some momentum. She was in one of her classes, her history class, when her teacher started talking about Anne Frank and giving a lesson on the World War II. Now, this right away confused Barbro because, in her head, she's like, how does my teacher know about Anne Frank? There's no way she could know about her. Like, how does she know about my life? How does she know about who I was? And this really, really confused her, especially being so young, being only 8 years old. But eventually she was able to kind of connect the dots and realize that Anne Frank had actually been someone famous. By the time she was 10 years old, her parents decided to kind of settle this once and for all, and they agreed to take Barbro to Amsterdam to see if there was any truth to everything she was saying. Right away, like literally right away, as soon as they got into Amsterdam, Barbro started saying that it was so good to be home, that she was so happy to be here. And of course, one of the things on their itinerary list was to go visit the Anne Frank house, which is now a museum in Amsterdam. They get out of their hotel and they're about to grab a cab to go to the house, but Barbro immediately tells her parents,
we were at the hotel room and my father said that let's do the Anne Frank house first. So I called for a cab. And I found myself saying to them, we don't need a cab, we're not far away.
So her parents were kind of a little weirded out by this. They were a little bit reluctant, but they agree and they say, okay, we'll follow you. Obviously, this shocked her parents, especially her mom, but they decided to keep going with it to see what else they could discover. Barbro walks up to the house, and the first thing she notices is that the steps are different. This is something she says out loud. She points it out to her parents. These steps used to be different. Barbro's walking through the streets of Amsterdam, kind of just leading her way there. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. Like, it was almost instinctive for her to know the way there. And right before they got to the house, she told her parents, okay, we're almost there. It's just around the corner. And lo and behold, as soon as they turned the corner, there was Anne Frank's house.
When I came into that house, it was the most horrifying feeling I have ever had. Because all of a sudden I was back to my dreams. I recognized everything I had seen ever since I was a little child. And I took my mother's hand, and when she felt how cold I was and sweaty I was, she said, my God, what's the matter with you? Don't you want to go in here? And I said, yes, I want to go. Just want to hold your hand.
So they're making their way through the house and they are climbing up the stairs and they eventually get to the bedroom that was once Anne Frank's. And right away, Barbro points out that the wall that was next to her bed was empty. And this was strange to her because she precisely remembers that this wall used to be covered with dozens of photos of celebrities and Hollywood stars of that time. So confused about it, her mother actually goes up to one of the employees at the museum and asks them whether or not this was true. And of course, they say, yes, this is true. But we had to take down the photos because people kept taking them. So what they were doing was that they were preserving them in like a plexiglass sort of situation, and they were going to put them back up once it was ready to be put up. They just wanted to avoid people from stealing them. So with that being confirmed, Barbro's mother finally accepted the truth. She finally realized that her daughter was actually Anne Frank reincarnated. As for Barbro's father, he was a man of his faith. He really did believe in God and Jesus, so he wanted no part of it. He kind of just dismissed all of it, and he acknowledged what was going on, but unfortunately he just didn't want to support the theory that everyone else had accepted. So he kind of just brushed it off and didn't really want to talk about it at all. By the time Barbro was 15, she said that she actually started experiencing less and less of these memories and flashbacks of her life as Anne Frank. And coincidentally, Anne Frank actually died when she was 15. And it wasn't until in her early 40s where she started experiencing these flashbacks again. And it was actually triggered by an experience, something very normal to most of us, actually having a problem with one of her colleagues. And at this point, she had become a mounted police officer. And part of this decision was influenced by her fear of people in uniform.
And even when I was older, even though I didn't have my memories left, I still had very difficult moments with certain things. And among those things was uniforms, police in uniforms.
So she decided, okay, well, if I become a police officer, the ones that ride on horses across Europe, so she said, or she figured that if she would become a police officer of this nature, that it would help get her over her fear of people in uniform. And it did to a certain extent until she met a certain colleague that triggered her, and she really started experiencing these flashbacks again. A lot of these flashbacks were of her being in the concentration camps, and then she remembers seeing pictures or images of this colleague in her past life. She was able to connect the dots and realize that this colleague was a former soldier of the Nazi concentration camps, which is why she was so triggered in the first place. We fast forward to 1995. Barbara is now an adult, and she actually had the opportunity to meet one of Anne's living relatives at the time who lived in Switzerland. And his name was actually Buddy Elias, and there's actually videotape. I'll insert it here.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was introduced to Anne Frank's last living relative that is her cousin and that lives in Switzerland. And I was introduced to him about 6 years ago by my publisher in Switzerland. And this Buddy Elias is a name, the cousin of Anne Frank. I knocked the door and Buddy opened, and at the same moment we just fell in each other's arms. He was crying and I was crying. And we just sat alone for 2 hours and we just talked and talked and talked.
In 1999, Barbro actually moved to California, and then eventually where she is now, she relocated to North Carolina, where she actually works with horses again. So that is the story of Anne Frank being reincarnated into the life of Barbro Karlen. What do you guys think about this story? Is reincarnation something that is definitely a real phenomenon that's going out there? We just don't happen to know too much about it. Do you guys believe in it at all? Do you not believe in it? I would be super interested to know about your thoughts, your opinions, and if you guys have any other really cool reincarnation stories, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Please remember to subscribe, hit the like button, tap the notification bell. It really, really does help us grow here on YouTube. Thank you again so much for your support. We will see you in the next video.